The next speaker is Suzanne Lacy. Just over a year ago, I had the opportunity to sit on a door stoop in Brooklyn with her and 400 other women that she had called on to come together in an informal discussion of gender rights. This was the first encounter I had with her live, and it was memorable. Long before that, Suzanne Lacy's work has accompanied my professional development through her work, writing, and her teaching, always from afar, I'm sorry to say. So I'm really, really pleased that she's joining us today, and I get to meet her for a second time. Lacy's work oscillates between artistic and pedagogical practices and has provoked major adjustments in both areas through her legendary performances from the 1970s on to today, and through her work as an educator. Whether in political roles, for instance as an Oakland, California Arts Commissioner, or in her academic leadership as a founding faculty at the California State University at Monterey, she considers pedagogy as fundamental to her artistic production and has worked for 8 years on, for instance, the University of Local Knowledge in Bristol, England, a distinct project. She's a founding chair of the Otis College of Art and Design's MFA in Public Practice in LA, and has lectured widely, has published over 70 texts of critical commentary, and has exhibited at institutions such as the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, the New Museum in New York, PS1 in New York, the Bilbao Museum in Spain. Scores of fellowships have been offered to her, including those by the Guggenheim Foundation, the Henry Moore Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and many others. Among her books are Mapping the Terrain, New Genre Public Art, Leaving Art, Performances, Publics, and Politics, the collected essays of Suzanne Lacy, and a book about her work has just been published by Sharon Irish called Suzanne Lacy, Space Between, actually 2010. And she's now delivering our second keynote lecture for the Education Day, entitled Dangerous Times for Dangerous Bodies. Thank you, Suzanne.
It's hard for me to be brief, but I'm going to make every effort, so I ask you to suffer with me when I read very fast, and I show you 10 years of work in about 10 minutes. I want to thank first Karen and Lucia San Ramon. Lucia is a dear friend of mine and has been very supportive in my work, and I particularly thank her for bringing me today. I'm also going to make one more apology, which is that I'm not going to discuss the massive legacy that most of you here know that comes from both Latin America and North America in terms of education. And even here I would include, as a footnote for the feminists out there, note that Judy Chicago's feminist pedagogy was developed simultaneous with Freire's translation in the United States. So there's a lot of overlap between artists and academics in this area. Okay, so let me start. Part one, Michael Brown's body. On August 1st, 2014, Michael Brown graduated from Normandy High School in Missouri. 8 days later, he was dead, his uncovered body lying in the street for 4 hours. His death sparked national protests on race and criminal justice in the United States. The school district Brown graduated from was among the poorest and most segregated in the state, last in overall academic performance, with 50% graduation rate for young men. The college he was destined for, of which much was made, has a mission to serve the unemployed, underpaid, unsatisfied, unskilled, unprepared, unmotivated, and unhappy. A mission which, to paraphrase Henry Giroux, demonstrates a sort of hidden order that larger political and economic considerations, such as crushing poverty, mammoth inequality, the brutalizing racism of the United States, and inequitous modes of financing public education, all disappear from the list of problems facing schooling. 5 miles away from Brown's High School, a mostly white public school in the top 10 of the state, has a 96% graduation rate. The racial injustices in criminal justice is, of course, and we all know here, an issue of human rights, but so is the right to an equal education, and these two are deeply connected. According to a UC Berkeley economist, students in the United States who spend their careers in segregated schools can look forward to a life on the margins, most likely to be poor, more likely to go to jail, to live in segregated neighborhoods. During my lifetime, the public school system in California has been systematically dismantled, accompanied by the development of a massive prison system. Again from Giroux, schooling for poor people and people of color, defined by the school-to-prison pipeline, has come to represent an appendage of the carceral state. This is not only an attack on public education, but it's an attack on democracy, and I'll explore that a bit today. Of course, this is not news to anybody here. Ferguson marks just another moment in a very long march, an Anita Hill Senate testimony, an Arab Spring, a gang rape on a bus in India, the disappearance of 43 students in Mexico, events that became global teach-ins on conditions under construction for decades. I'm now going to go 2.5 decades earlier, at the beginning of 1990s, to offer a case study. The 90s decade offered another clash, this time a false war between youth and adults with quite ominous predictions. Time magazine called it a ticking teenage time bomb. In 1990, the everyday conditions for poor youth of color in Oakland, California, resulted from 3 decades of state political processes that had degraded public education, increased youth poverty, and built an empire of prisons. As Mike Males pointed out, the income of California youth between 1970 and 1990 dropped precipitously, leaving a large percentage of the state's youth in poverty. These changes were coincident with many statewide trends, but 2 are relevant here. Demographic changes in age, the state population was becoming much younger, and ethnicity. The minority population was on its way to becoming the majority. As Christopher Robbins comments, children and youth became both contested and embodied beings, collateral casualties or even direct targets in neoliberalism's then emerging war on the public. And why wouldn't they be? They depend as a function of their limited political and social rights on various institutions associated with the social states, like schools, community organizations, and so on. It's difficult to attack the institutions on which the young depend without attacking the young themselves. And indeed, that's what happened in Oakland, and actually around the United States. So the rise of a youth culture globally was accompanied by a backlash that took place in media and politics. California is an extreme example. Key targets of neoliberal ideology were youth crime, teenage pregnancy, and the failures of public education. Young black men appeared in handcuffs nightly on television, and young women of color were central in welfare reform debates. Anti-immigration laws, welfare reform, and harsher sentencing, all in the 1990s, can thank the appearance of black and brown bodies, and young ones at that, in the popular imagination during that decade. For example, discussing welfare reform, then Governor Pete Wilson conflated teen pregnancy with just about every other problem going on in the United States. He said, "Of course, as out-of-wedlock births have increased, so have public spending massively for health care for the poor, for police protection, for drug and rehabilitation centers, for criminal courts, for prisons, probation, and parole supervision. Welfare reform, he suggested, and I'd love you to listen to the language, offers us the opportunity so that taxpayers no longer subsidize idleness or promiscuity, and no longer suffer when illegitimacy hatches into social pathology. It's a direct quote. Meanwhile, young people's actual experiences were private knowledges locked inside communities that had little purchase on public voice. A vibrant youth culture and large percentage of African Americans, Oakland was an epicenter of cultural politics and activist organizing. But the co-option of youth culture by the market economy turned potential protest into a commodity, and youth performance of defiance heightened public fear. On this neoliberal, what he called the neoliberal public pedagogy, anti-public pedagogy, Chris Robbins says, it takes considerable symbolic and material work across a range of sites and relationships for adults to unhinge youth, along with public institutions and agencies that were once beyond politics, beyond right and left, from our collective commitments to each other. So I want to tell you briefly about these 10 years of work, and then I'm going to talk about the public, and then I'm going to talk about pedagogy and how coming together they help us as artists think through some of the issues of politics that we deal with. The Oakland projects were based on media analysis. We served youth as a function of our ethics, and we did extensive youth service and development and pedagogy, but we were basically trying to operate upon and reconfigure media within the city of Oakland and the Bay Area. We focused on the politics of youth representation and changing direct policies and programs. The projects were discursive and layered. We asked who was the primary voice, who needed to hear the conversation, what else was needed, what ethical situations are arising, and how could people be mobilized to support youth. So the project, we partnered with the county, with the city, with police departments, with health, with nonprofit, with youth, primarily with youth, and with other artists. A very large group of over 500 people that sort of moved, some on this project, some on the other over time. And of course, as youth graduated, went to college, came back, they began to work on the projects as leaders as well. We deployed youth development principles, but youth development wasn't our primary objective. It was to basically stage a conversation in public around reconfiguring publics in the service of young people and with young people at the center. We made 8 major performances, several exhibitions, scores of media interventions, of course, video documentaries, including an NBC Hour documentary. We had probably over, I believe it was over 1,000 young people in workshops over the course of these 10 years. I'm going to tell you just now briefly the 4 areas that we were focusing on. One is high schools. So in several pieces, we launched ourselves into the Oakland Unified School System, learning firsthand, for those of us like myself who are college educators, about youth in Oakland. And this is a performance that students requested us to do with their teachers to facilitate conversation performatively over a course of 4 months. Most of the projects were longer, like this one, No Blood, No Foul. In 2 projects, over the course of basically 5 years, we explored the perception of youth by police and by communities, and we set up prototype police training programs and partnered with the City Council to pass an Oakland youth policy. Media had pronounced a teenage pregnancy crisis. In Expectations, we developed a county-based arts curriculum for pregnant and parenting teens and advocated for young people in the state legislature. And finally, with direct work with the police department over the course of years, we explored how public attitudes increased incarceration rates. Code 33, which I'll talk about in a minute, posed the question, how can art be embedded in an ongoing way within institutions? So I'm going to talk briefly about these 2 projects, and then I'm going to talk about public and pedagogy. Roof is on fire. When I grew up, California was one of the top school systems in the US. I was the first in my working class family to graduate because legislation guaranteed me a right to a college education. But in 1978, Prop 13 was passed to stabilize property values. Over time, it gutted public schools and laid the foundation for today's massive overcrowding, high dropout rates, outdated infrastructure, school violence, and exodus of white students to private school. So from 1965 to 1995, over the course of 30 years, California went from 7th in ranking in the United States to 41st, where it's there or below today. The Oakland Unified School District entered the 90s in bankruptcy. Middle-income white people had taken their kids out of public schools, further eroding tax base and parental support. Oakland schools were effectively, as with Michael Brown's school, segregated. Public schools were 95% black or people of color, and private schools were 95% white. Public school test scores were among the lowest in the state. Schools in the poorer neighborhoods, called the flatlands, faced more than a lack of funding. Their schools took on the ominous trappings of a prison. So in this 3-year project, I'm just going to break down, this took course over about 2 to 3 years. There were a series of performances and so on, but they were based around media literacy for high school students, a curriculum we developed. Later, a course by professionals like Todd Gitlin and Troy Duster and television professionals, a course to teach teachers how to incorporate media literacy. Then in the spring of '94, we developed an extensive 40 young person over 8 college planning group, and they planned a performance called Roof is on Fire. So the performance took place on this rooftop, started with a hook and ladder in the fire department, and upstairs on the very top roof, 220 teenagers talked to each other with a listening audience of over 1,000 people from Oakland. As the sun went down, offering, and the young people themselves, of course, had selected their conversations. So I'm not going to talk more about this. At some point, maybe you'll check out my website. I've got a lot of videos posted that give you the voice of the people, which I normally prefer to do in my presentations. So you'll see that these young people were highly charismatic, very poignant, and the piece was, had quite a place in the legacy of Oakland. But I want to talk a little bit more about Code 33 because of the relationship between education and incarceration. So our young people, the leadership team, said, I remember I was in a restaurant one morning and one of the young people said, as a group of police officers came in, maybe we should do the next performance with cops. And so over the next 2.5 years or longer, we began a project that dealt with community perception and police perception of youth and each other and how that mix is set up in Oakland. California had become a national test case for the restoration of what politicians called moral and social order through the courts and prisons. The public debate over juvenile crime was dominated by 2 voices: elected officials seizing on quick fix solutions and media selling itself through violent crime reporting. That crimes actually started dropping mid-decade seemed to make little difference, and here's the writer from the Time magazine. There are widespread predictions that another tidal wave will break as soon as the milk-toothed children of the 90s crowd into their saw-toothed teens. Prison building began in earnest. California beefed up police forces, imposed tougher sentences in response to public anger over crime. The number of inmates topped 1 million in the summer when we did our last performance. About half of the increase in the cost of incarceration was financed by shifting resources from higher education to prisons. Lost in the rising concern over crime was this simple fact: young people of color were far more likely to be the victims rather than the perpetrators of a criminal act. The most likely young homicide victim at that time in Oakland was an African-American man between the ages of 20 and 24. It's almost a given that a gun would be the weapon that caused his death. So 5 years after Roof is on Fire, on the same rooftop, we held Code 33 Emergency Clear the Air, preceded by extensive work in communities with community policing, putting young people, teaching young people how to speak in public, teaching them video skills, and so on, involving in particular a very dramatic youth police training program, which was completely videotaped and you can see, and in fact I'll show you a minute if we have time of the video. And then the performance. And the performance, as you might imagine, was quite loaded. It featured protests for free mumia downstairs. It featured police jumping up and down and young people in the groups. Every group, 30 groups on the top of this roof, 250 people in all. Every group was facilitated by a trained facilitator. And around the outside of this roof, there were videotapes by 8 young people's teams looking at the neighborhoods of Oakland. So you would look at their point of view and look out over the rooftops to the city as the sun went down. And then halfway through the performance, the audience, the young people got up and left and went downstairs, and the audience began to witness, first from above and downstairs, the community platform. So the first act was youth police conflict and dialogue. The second was a stage of community enactment. There's a mentorship table in the middle. There's young people, dancing troupes. There's 8 platforms where people from different neighborhoods spoke about their experience of young people and youth. And of course, as everywhere, there were young people videoing and interviewing. So let me talk now about public pedagogy. Oakland was about pedagogy, of course. We did a lot of curriculum for police officers, for teachers, and so on, but that's not why I consider it a piece of pedagogy. That this is a term that is derived from critical pedagogy, and it's particularly useful, I think, in thinking about social practices and art. It explores the connections between education and democracy. So, the public. Well, like artists, pedagogy uses the term, artists use the term public in a variety of ways. Glenn Savage, as a public pedagogue, says that the word we often use is to evoke a particular unstated public that will be educated. Theorists deploy public pedagogy to refer variously from the union state to popular culture to everybody to concrete publics. Each descriptor raises different issues of scale, context, political intentions, efficacy, and ethics. In Oakland, we focused on concrete publics. Each community that we became engaged with, each advocacy organization that we met with, each politician and so on, gave us in conversation the opportunity for what I would call a mini public in both extra-institutional and institutional sites, or a concrete public. And then of course there were 2 versions for us of the broader notion of public. One was to denote our political position. That is, our relationship to the formation of publicness and the values of youth, of youth, addressing youth issues. The other was around city government, and we did a lot of work, as this is, in the Bay Area with politicians. Each small public was contextualized by the whole, and the whole came together during the performance. I could talk another time later about how some of the methodology worked in terms of meeting an organization like the mentoring organization, taking some of their ideas, creating a mentorship structure within the performance where artists mentored youth. All artists had to have a youth that they worked with, and also within the performance itself, like on the platform. But I want to turn, in the interest of time, to pedagogy. This notion, in the literature, there are also many uses of the term pedagogy. One of the things as an artist I find most useful is those that focus on the encounter. And I like this because it works both within a classroom and on the street. It also has elements of performativity. Ruben Gastambide Fernandez y Alexandra Matute argue that pedagogy always implies a relationship that is driven by intentions and desires for particular kinds of shifts in subjectivity. That's a little problematic ethically. To embrace, through our performances, and I'll explain that in a minute, through our performances and installations, we created a stage, a public platform for multivocal expressions of the material conditions and subjectivities of all participants, to both empower the youth and to reframe public beliefs by exposing the human perspective within complex social situations. Thus, the size of a performance was as important to us as it is to a rally or a strike, because these were positioned as political interventions. Having constituted these small and diverse publics over the course of 2 or 3 years, the performance would bring them together. The relationship between private experience and public life was central to the early feminist project and remains an important aspect of arts-based social practice. Can individual subjectivities revealed in a public context help frame our political understanding? Can choreographed conversations give rise to new and embodied knowledges? Performance conversations were sculpted through, not scripted, but sculpted through an elaborate process which we called rehearsals, but featured months of community organizing and conversations about specifically what people wanted to talk about in the performances. The audience was kept out of the conversation in order to listen, forced through steps in the politics of perception toward intimacy, and witness to the youth claimed a public voice. And of course, I'm drawn to the work of another educator, artist, Augusto Boal, and he says about this kind of public space and why exactly what the role of the audience is within this space. The aesthetic space is the creation of the audience. It requires nothing more than their attentive gaze in a single direction for this space to become aesthetic, powerful, hot, five-dimensional. The objects no longer carry out their usual daily signification, and this is very important when you think about the media significations of youth and police, but become the stuff of memory and imagination. One interesting aspect, and I referred to a moment ago, of Gastambide, Fernandez, and Matute's construction of pedagogy as an intentional and relational space is that it does not allow us to facilely elide the discomfort caused by acknowledgement of subtle and not so subtle hierarchies that exist in the process of construction. We must begin, they contend, with the intention of one subject to influence the life of another, to push against, in a manner of speaking, another's subjectivity. To do otherwise, to focus on learning what is learned rather than this encounter, whether it's in a classroom or in the middle of a performance, basically opens the door for ignoring how hierarchies and dynamics yield the desire to influence another and the conditions that enable whether and how pedagogy occurs. This transparency is a dangerous practice that constructs the circumstances for ethics to emerge. If always driven, as he posits or they posit, driven by desires and intention, the central question becomes whose desires and intentions are enacted pedagogically and to what end. There is, however, for most of us, and particularly for artists, another question, and that has to do with the prior encounter to the pedagogic one. How did we come into relationship in the first place? Chris Johnson, my collaborator from Bed-Stuy in New York, and a photographer, and a substantive influence on this work, we began our narratives of the Oakland Project, always basically talking about how we, in 1990, would walk out the doors of our college and not know a thing about the kids that were gathered waiting for the bus. According to Freire, good teachers are intellectually unfinished. Our curiosity prompted 10 years of work for us. And many people teach as a commitment to their own learning. So this notion of pushing against that has to do with the pedagogic situation might in fact be, depending upon the ability to analyze, to keep transparent, to keep up the kinds of ethical issues that rise in the work, the hierarchies that exist inevitably in the work. Those, the notion of pushing against the subjectivity of others could as well be turned on oneself. I like, in particular, Sandy's Hillel's comment from this morning, I have the power to decolonize my own mind. So with deliberative and self-reflective discourse that spanned 10 years, ethical questions were central, shared by all major participants. Challenges came from youth, from police, from artists, from politicians, teachers, nonprofit leaders, and audience members. And in a community as politicized as Oakland, the challenges were intense. And it was our commitment to make these challenges transparent throughout, sometimes, in fact often, painfully so. They weren't always resolved, but the intention to allow different subjectivities as a visible presence in the center of this work was a commitment to engaging with the ethics of the pedagogical encounter. Knowledge, Bell Hooks suggested, is a field in which we all labor. Gert Biesta suggests that the practice of public pedagogy might be more profitably cited not in education and not in politics, but at the intersection of the two, to specify in Hannah Ernst's terms the condition where action is possible and freedom can occur or can appear. Public pedagogy appears as an enactment of a concern for publicness, that is, a concern for the public quality of human togetherness and thus for the possibility of actors and events to become public. Becoming public becomes more activist because it's aimed at the creation of real alternatives. Such work is always experimental because it's about the invention of new ways of being and doing. It is, in fact, something we could apply to the intersection between education, politics, and art. Such forms of experimental activism in the interests of the public quality of human togetherness can be understood as forms of pedagogy, a pedagogy of demonstration. Hands up, don't shoot. I can't breathe. Crowds chanted across the country. Masses of bodies lay prone on the Brooklyn Bridge in New York and the Nimitz Freeway in response to the killings of Michael Brown and Eric Garner and the acquittal of police involved in their deaths. Bell Hooks' statement on suffering is resonant here. Suffering is a way of knowing that is often expressed through the body, what it knows, what has been deeply inscribed through experience. What were youth leaders on rooftops in televisions in Oakland portraying? Individual subjectivities, voices simultaneously echoing across the roof, represented the very process of democracy. And their dangerous bodies, made approachable in performance, made intimate by listening, allowed the students to return to themselves, in Bell Hooks' words, to a state of embodiment in order to deconstruct the way power has been traditionally orchestrated. It calls to mind, finally, Augusto Wall's performances. He said, to engage is to become situated in a space between the individual and the socialized category of all such individuals. She says, Boal's techniques point the way to an awareness of society's politicization of gender, race, class, family, and the psyche. And finally, in Bell Hooks' words, coming to voice, and this is the focus and purpose of the Oakland projects, is not just the act of telling one's experience. It is using that telling strategically to come to voice so that you can speak on other subjects. As neoliberalism has become the wallpaper of contemporary life, according to Chris Robbins, they edge out other discourses, and with them the variety of voices involved in their constitutions. Voice matters and should matter as a value to humans. Treating voice as a value means discriminating against frameworks of social and political organization that deny or undermine voice. And finally, I'm just skipping to the end, a quote from Chris Robbins. It takes considerable work over, in our case, the course of 10 years, considerable careful attention to the public and its various problems, to highlight the critical roles that materiality plays in people's relationship to the public and the construction of material public spaces in which people can come together to do the difficult and ethical, always pedagogical work of citizens. And if I've got, would you say a minute, 2 minutes? I've got a video for 2.5 minutes because can't possibly let you not hear from some of these people involved. Alejandro, did I goof? I think I goofed up. There we go. Thank you. Thank you.
I haven't had a single positive experience in my life. So,
Look, to tell you the truth, I couldn't be around police without my stomach turning.
Be higher.
In 10 years as a police officer, I have never seen a police officer hit a person that's been handcuffed. I'm not saying that that does not happen. Obviously, it happens. But I have never seen it.
It happened in Riverside to a young girl. What are you talking about? That never happened. I get shot down. Now, because you're a cop and because you made a mistake that I was reaching for something and because you ran my name and 4 years ago I have something on my record, I got shot and it's okay. You may not even lose your job. That's how you're above the law. You can't, and you have to admit that.
Let me give you an example. A decorated cop, all right? 15 years in the force, kicking ass. The whole 15 years he's on.
the whole 15 years.
Meaning he's been making, hey, that's right. That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a good cop. I didn't say he was doing anything against him. I'm talking about a good cop. 15 years on the streets, all right? Everybody knows him. Everybody likes him in the part of the citizens. Like, he goes out there and makes a mistake like that. What do you think should happen to him? Yeah, that's what I thought. That's your attitude, though. Hey, that's what I thought. That's what I thought. A good cop like that probably has 10 more years on the streets, he makes one freaking mistake. That's how people are. Screw him, get him out of there.
15 years on the street kicking ass, whatever, right? He makes one mistake, but we're on the streets and we make one mistake. And what happens to us?
Make one mistake, meaning what? One mistake about what?
25.
I don't understand what you mean when you say
Like breaking the law. Saying if young people break the law, they don't get a second chance.
That's not true. That is not true.
Especially not young.
That is not true.
We just got we got here late here on a case where a guy just paroled after doing 3 years for murder. He did 3 years for murder. Okay, so there are second chances.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suzanne. That was absolutely fantastic. Wonderful to hear all these incredibly profound thoughts that I don't really want to reduce to a few catchphrases, but there were things like the ethical and pedagogical work of citizenship towards the end, and the question of pedagogy as when it is defined as something that's purely intentional and creating a relational space. Thank you very, very much.
Did I goof? I think I goofed up. There we go. Thank you. Thank you.
I haven't had a single positive experience in my life. So,
Well, to tell you the truth, I couldn't be around police without my stomach turning.
Be higher.
In 10 years as a police officer, I have never seen a police officer hit a person that's been handcuffed. I'm not saying that that does not happen. Obviously, it happens, but I have never seen it.
It happened in Riverside to a young girl. What are you talking about? That never happened. I get shot down. Now, because you're a cop and because you made a mistake that I was reaching for something and because you ran my name and 4 years ago I have something on my record, I got shot and it's okay. You may not even lose your job. That's how you're above the law. And you can't, and you have to admit that.
Let me give you an example. A decorated cop, all right? 15 years in the force, kicking ass. The whole 15 years he's on.
the whole 15 years.
Meaning he's been making, hey, that's right. That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a good cop. I didn't say he was doing anything against, so I'm talking about a good cop. 15 years on the streets, all right? Everybody knows him. Everybody likes him in the Department of Citizens. Like, he goes out there and makes a mistake like that. What do you think should happen to him? Yeah, that's what I thought. That's your attitude, though. Hey, that's what I thought. That's what I thought. A good cop like that probably has 10 more years on the streets, he makes one freaking mistake. That's how people are. Screw him, get him out of there.
15 years on the street kicking ass, whatever, right? He makes one mistake, but we're on the streets and we make one mistake, and what happens to us?
Make one mistake, meaning what? One mistake about what?
25.
I don't understand what you mean when you say that.
Like breaking the law.
Saying if young people break the law, they don't get a second chance.
That's not true. That is not true.
Especially
not young.
That is
Not true at all.
true.
We just got done, we got here late here on a case where a guy just paroled after doing, 3 years for murder. He did 3 years for murder. Okay? So there are second chances.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suzanne. That was absolutely fantastic. Wonderful to hear all these incredibly profound thoughts that I don't really want to reduce to a few catchphrases, but there were things like the ethical and pedagogical work of citizenship towards the end, and the question of pedagogy as when it is defined as something that's purely intentional and creating a relational space. Thank you very, very much.